and that form does not lead us to place a great deal of trust in them. I'll take questions.
Now you're saying about all this intergovernmental thing. Well, from what I'm standing here, I think to myself, the only thing we can do is do nothing. Because if you're talking about, you know, this Penny Wong having all this money and
do nothing about what?
All these other lobbies. In some way, it'd be best to do nothing.
About what? About what?
Well, about this climate change, because it's something that we can't control. Because
thank you, sir.
Thank you. One day we'll be gone, and that's it.
We have your point. We have your point. Thank you for making it. I will come to that in my next section. I'm going to talk about that very thing.
What is the weight of in the scientific literature of the percentage of scientific literature that is in favour of human-induced climate change? And
the question is, what is the percentage of the scientific literature that's in favour of climate change or against climate change? One answer to that question is nobody knows. The second answer to the question is it's not the business of the scientific literature to be in favour of anything. It's the job of scientists, and I'm sorry, I'm not being rude to you, I'm just reacting off the top of my head. It's the job of scientists to test hypotheses, and I gave you a simple example of that earlier. Now, there's a thing called the null hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that you use that is the simplest interpretation of the observed facts. I've already referred to it. We live on a dynamic planet. We observe around us warmings and coolings in the temperature. The simplest hypothesis, and therefore the null hypothesis, is those changes we observe are natural, unless and until we have evidence otherwise. Right? That's the null hypothesis. There are tens of thousands of research papers in refereed journals that have data relevant to testing the hypothesis. There is not a single one of those papers that invalidates that hypothesis. That doesn't mean the hypothesis is right. You never know a science hypothesis is right. Science is not about proving that things are, it's about setting up sensible relationships and hypotheses and then attempting to disprove them, and you never stop trying. The fact I'm viewed as a skeptic doesn't mean I don't try to test both sides of the climate story.
Clarify about the models. I'm going to find the other area properly, but I understand like one of the models is to test if it's going to get warmer.
Yes.
Is that what you said? And the other model has proved that we're going to get colder.
The lady's asking about the two types of models, and I realise that's a very difficult thing to explain with just a microphone and no graphs. The two types of models are general circulation models, or GCMs, which specify the climate system mathematically. And you set them going, and out the other end comes the temperature in 100 years' time. That's GCMs. The other sort of climate model, and all of those at the moment that are in the public domain, project warming over the next 100 years. The other sort of model is you look at ancient climate data and you fit a mathematical relationship to that data and you project that mathematical relationship forward. Those models, and there are several of them, all project cooling over the next 20 years. But most of them then say it'll warm again and it'll cool again because that's what climate does. We observe that's what it does in the past.
Are you suggesting that the people, the scientists on the Intergovernmental Panel are sort of being dishonest to true science and perhaps just making statements that really they don't see enough evidence for?
The question is, am I suggesting the scientists on the Intergovernmental Panel are being dishonest? The answer is no. I would never suggest that in public of a brother or sister scientist. You have to ask them. All I can say is I'm not impressed with their reasoning. But that's a scientific issue. It's not my evaluation of their character. Back?
Yeah. Thanks, Bob, for the talk so far. It's been great. I wanted to talk about, you only really hear one side of the story. It's quite rare to hear this side of it. And
why is that?
Question. Well, that's what I'm sort of coming to. And what I'm starting to hear is that unless a scientist is talking about the sky falling in and being very alarmist, then they're not going to get government money. And the media is not going to give them a voice. What can you tell me about your peers as scientists? And you know, can you get a job if you've got...
What I can tell you is I can provide you with a list of 100 names of excellent, not average run-of-the-mill, excellent scientists around the world who would agree with virtually every word I'm saying tonight. They choose different words to use it, but the thrust of what I'm saying they would agree with. Now you tell me what the age demography is of that group of 100 scientists.
About 50?
About Europe? About
Yeah,
your demographic?
yeah, 95% of 95 out of 100 are over 65. The people in this game I have the greatest sympathy for are young to mid-career scientists. They are in a situation where they are intimidated, they will not get research funds unless they fit in with the conventional wisdom. It's a disgrace, but it's the reality. So you often hear people being critical of scientists and say, why aren't you speaking out like Bob Carter? And the answer is, Bob Carter's an old fox who isn't beholden to anybody. Nobody pays me a salary, I'm not getting research grants anymore, nobody has any hold over me. Most scientists that work on this issue in all Western countries are under the thumb of the research management scheme of which they are a part. Sorry, I'm going to say one other thing. Have any of you heard of AMUNC? It's a United Nations Youth Conference for Southeast Asia that's on at Sydney University this week. None of you heard of it? Well, partly answering my rhetorical question earlier, why haven't you heard more of the other side of the story? I was invited 6 months ago to participate in a panel discussing climate change to this United Nations Youth Conference. That's one of the reasons I'm in Sydney, as well as Bishop Porteous' invitation to be here tonight. Last Thursday, I received a letter telling me that CSIRO had complained about my presence on the panel and my invitation was withdrawn.
You haven't yet commented about the impact on the oceans, which has got nothing to do with the model, as I understand it.
Sure. Can I come back to that if there's time at the end? It's a very good question, but it's also a complex question.
Sure. Okay.
The question, the gentleman's asking about ocean acidification. And I'd just like to try, because we haven't got a lot of time, and I would like to try to get through this first.
Well, that's an important issue, and the other issue relating to the other questions is in being very concerned about the IPCC, and with your comments there, it makes me wonder, by analogy within the church, we look at our bishops as leaders, we are trusting them to help us understand various things. One could argue that bishops or priests might be under pressure as well, but again we agree with what they're saying because we're trusting them. And in spite of all what you said, I find it remarkable if there was any major scientific organisation in any country that would be so openly concerned so significantly about the IPCC as what you have shared with us.
But I'm not an organisation.
No, that I'm making an analogy here about how we as the non-scientific or non-
Oh sure, how do you judge, I mean...
how we take on board information, how we listen. By all means we need to think about things, but we should think very carefully.
I'll answer that question right at the end. If I don't, just remind me of the poster on the wall. And of course, the bishop here is indeed under pressure, but he's under pressure from somebody who's much stronger and not able to be influenced than anything we're dealing with in the research funding realm, or at least I think that's the case. Okay, so now I want to talk briefly about Plan A, Plan B, and I want to conclude with, is this a moral issue? Which is partly where you're coming from. Plan A. Well, Plan A is what Mr. Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull and now Julia Gillard has put off, but she hasn't abandoned. Plan A is trying to stop climate change, or rather, more expressly, trying to stop dangerous global warming. Have you ever heard a politician say they're going to stop an earthquake? Have you ever heard a politician say they're going to stop a volcanic eruption? What would you think of a politician that said that? Yeah, Virginia Trivoli, remember? And Diana Joyce was interviewed. Wonderful. Anyway, trying to stop climate change, you might as well try and stop the cloud scudding. In fact, that's exactly what you are trying to do. It is just as absurd to pretend you can try and stop climate change as it is to try and stop an earthquake or a volcanic eruption. These are all examples of natural hazards. The Earth is a dynamic planet. Earthquakes happen, volcanic eruptions happen, climate change happens. Get used to it. Climate change is both warming and cooling. And of those two directions, cooling is far more dangerous. Right at the moment, the statistical computer models and experienced solar physicists are telling us we're going to be cooling for 20 years. Get used to it. Don't try and stop it.